Hi everyone, just wanted to take a minute to talk about how to complete the square to solve quadratic equations. So completing the square is one of the tougher techniques for solving a quadratic equation because there's a couple important steps that you have to make sure that you do not miss. So essentially, as a reminder, what we're doing is we're making a perfect square trinomial so that way we can ultimately then use square roots to solve the quadratic equation. So the first step that we are going to do in a situation like this is we're going to move the c over to the other side. And I'm going to end up with a negative 49. So I have x squared plus 16x equals negative 49. Now you'll notice I left a little bit of a space here. And the reason behind that was because we're going to add something to both sides. And the value that we add to both sides is b over 2 squared. So we take b, which is 16, then we have b over 2. So that's just 16 over 2, which is 8. And now we square it and add it to both sides. So when we do that, we have to ultimately add the 64. And the reason we're doing this again is so that way we can rewrite this as a perfect square trinomial. So now we end up in the scenario we have x squared plus 16x plus 64. And that is ultimately going to be equal to 15. All right, so now because of what we just did, we added b over 2 squared to both sides. This should be in the form of a perfect square trinomial. So we can actually rewrite this as x plus 8 squared equals 15. And the reason behind that is because this is 8 squared. This is 2 times 8, which is b, right? And then that is what we're looking for in the perfect square trinomial. That was one of our special cases of factoring. So now we take the square root of both sides. Again, because we're solving an equation, we do not know if it's the positive or negative answer, so we have to include both. All right, and then I'm going to subtract the 8. And I'm going to end up with a scenario where I'm getting negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 15. Now, sometimes you end up with a radical that you can simplify. In our case, we couldn't, so we just left it alone. So this is how we're going to leave our answer because there's no further way that we can simplify that. I know it's a little bit unsettling and a little bit difficult to kind of see that sometimes, but that is how we're ultimately going to leave our answer. So I'm just going to go down here and let's look at another situation where we have to complete the square. And you'll see this one's a little bit different. So when we look at this problem, we see right away, first of all, that the wrong term is on the right-hand side, so we do need to rectify that. But the other thing that we see right away is that our a is not 1. So there's a couple things that we can do when we end up in a scenario where a is not 1. Number one, we can see if it'll divide out nicely. And in this case, it actually will. But if it didn't, we would have to factor it out and divide everything by a, so that way we could have a times a quadratic where a was 1, because the factoring method of completing the square relies on a being 1 to create that perfect square trinomial. Now, let's look at this scenario. As I said, the wrong term's on this side, so let's get this on the right side. So let's subtract 32x from both sides. So we get 4x squared minus 32x plus 36 equals 0. Once again, we've ended up in a scenario, as I said, where we can factor out the 4. So the first thing you're going to do when you are in a scenario where a is not 1 is you should also factor out whatever a is. So luckily in this case, it is evenly divisible. So 32 divided by 4 is 8x and then plus 9. and that is 0. We divide both sides by 4, divide both sides by 4, and we're just left with x squared minus 8x plus 9 equals 0. And that doesn't affect our solutions because the 4 is just a scalar. It just affects how quickly it's increasing. It doesn't affect the points of intersection. So now we again need to complete the square. So we're going to subtract the 9, I'm going to write it over here because I have a little more room. So I have x squared minus 8x equals negative 9. Now, to solve this next part, we again have to take b, divide it by 2, and then square it. So negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. Negative 4 squared is 16, so I'll add 16 to this. All right, so I get x squared minus 8x plus 16, and that is ultimately equal to 7. All right. Assuming we did this right, this should be a perfect square trinomial. So we do need to be careful. It is a minus 4 squared, and that's still equal to the 7. So now again, we take the square root. Remember the plus or minus. So we get x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. As we know, we can't really do anything with the square root of 7, so we're going to leave it alone. And then we just add the 4 to both sides, plus 4. So my final answer is ultimately going to be x is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of 7. Now this is really nice because it means if I tried to factor it from the get-go, I was not going to be able to do it. If you ended up in a scenario where you just got a number, it would have been factorable. But ultimately, when you end up like this, it means you're going to have to either use the quadratic equation or the quadratic formula or complete the square. So I hope this helps. Best of luck. Let me know if you have any questions.